Our story today is found in Luke chapter 22 and John chapter 18, and it's the account of Peter's denial. Simon, Simon, Satan has asked to sift all of you as wheat, but I've prayed for you, Simon, that your faith may not fail, and when you have turned back, strengthen your brothers. Peter declared, Even if all fall away, I will not. Lord, I am ready to go with you to prison and to death. I tell you, Peter, before the cock crows today, you will deny 3 times that you even know me. Peter was determined to prove Jesus wrong. When the silence of the garden had shattered by betrayal and sword, Peter had drawn his weapon. When the others fled into the night, Peter joined John in following their Lord and friend to learn his fate. Now the torchlight bobbed along ahead of them as they struggled to quiet their breath and cling to the shadows. Their eyes never left the mass of heavily armed Roman guards as it coursed through the streets before them. Dogs barked as frightened residents peered anxiously out of their windows at the sound of the marching sandals and clinking armor. Though they could not see him, Peter and John knew Jesus was somewhere in the center of the mob of angry men. Bit by bit, the terrain before them steepened as they left behind the more modest dwellings of the middle class and entered the eastern slope of the upper city, the home of aristocracy, awash in luxury and wealth. It was a world of sprawling mansions, servants, priceless furnishings, and breathtaking views. These were the homes of the high priests. The guards in front slowed their pace and stopped at the largest residence on the block, the home of High Priest Annas. Peter looked at John and saw relief wash over his face in the moonlight. John reached up and placed his hand on Peter's shoulders. Come, he said. I know Annas. I've been here many times. We can go inside. John led the way, falling in line behind the group, proceeding through the entrance in front of them. A servant girl stood in the doorway, scanning the faces of each person entering the residence. When she saw John, a brief look of recognition flickered through her eyes, and she said nothing. But when Peter tried to follow, she stopped him. No, I'm sorry. But I'm with him, Peter protested, motioning to rapidly disappearing John. The servant girl just shook her head and began to close the gate. Peter began pacing back and forth in front of the house. He paused, took one last look at the unflinching face of the servant girl staring back at him through the gate, and then looked up at the impenetrable 2-story structure looming before him. He walked over to the wall and leaned wearily against it. He had promised Jesus he would be faithful no matter what, and now he couldn't even get in the door. For a moment, all was still. And then Peter began to hear hushed voices, the turning of the key in the lock and the cracking of the gate as it swung open. He turned just in time to see John step outside and motion him to follow. The girl gazed at him suspiciously as he passed, and as he and John descended the steps into the residence, she felt her eyes follow him. At the bottom of the steps, Peter entered the vestibule. A beautiful mosaic graced the center of the floor. Elaborate patterns swirled in red, blue, and yellow around the large rosette in the center. Pomegranates, symbolic of the priesthood, were inlaid in the corners of the design. A small table rested against the left wall of the vestibule between the 2 doors. Both led into the expansive reception hall where the proceedings were taking place. John motioned to Peter to go into the courtyard at the end of the hall to wait before slipping inside to be with Jesus. Peering inside the room for a moment, Peter saw that it could easily accommodate a large group. The stucco that covered the walls had been treated to give the appearance of stone panels. The ceiling was equally elaborate. There the stucco was imprinted with a complex, intertwining geometric design. Lamplight flickered against the opulence of the space, the magnificent architecture and luxurious furnishings, and at last the crowd of people who seethed with fury. Jesus, still bound, was standing silently in the center. Tearing his eyes away from the scene, Peter turned to gain his bearings. To the right of the vestibule was another room, even more lavishly decorated than the reception hall. The walls were completely covered with frescoes of rich reds and bold yellows depicting various architectural elements. Peter turned and made his way to the end of the vestibule to enter the courtyard. Various rooms flanked the large flagstone paved courtyard that anchored the home. Another spacious wing, equal in size to the one Peter had just exited, stretched along the far end. This night the courtyard was a very busy place. The guards had gathered there to await further instructions from the officials inside the home. Because the night was cold, someone had already begun a fire in the brazier in the center of the yard. Peter cautiously made his way to the edge of the group and found a seat. Lamplight from the tall windows of the reception hall fell into the courtyard below, and though Peter could not be inside to witness the proceedings, he could hear the priest questioning Jesus. "I have spoken openly to the world," Jesus replied. "I always taught in the synagogues or at the temple, where all the Jews came to gather. I said nothing in secret. Why question me? Ask those who heard me. Surely they know what I said." Peter winced at the sound of the high priest's palm striking Jesus' face, drifted across the courtyard, and then gave way to the angry rumblings of the crowd. At that moment, a servant girl crossed the courtyard from the east wing of the house, carrying a large ornate green glass pitcher. She slowed when she saw Peter, and then paused to look at him closely. "You were also with the Nazarene Jesus," she said. Guards turned to look at him suspiciously. Peter quickly stood to his feet and angrily responded, "I don't know or understand what you're talking about," he said. Peter moved closer to the entrance and away from the crowd. Meanwhile, the voices from inside the hall were growing louder and angrier by the moment. Peter heard the voice of the high priest rise above the din. "I charge you under oath by the living God, tell us if you are the Messiah, the Son of God." A moment of heavy silence followed. Then came Jesus' voice, calm and strong. "You have said so," Jesus replied. "But I say to all of you, from now on you will see the Son of Man sitting on the right hand of the Mighty One, coming in the clouds of heaven." Matthew 26:64. "Blasphemy!" the high priest cried as he reached up and grasped the collar of his robe with both hands and tore the robe in two. "What do you think?" he demanded to the crowd. "What should we do with this man?" The hall erupted as screams demanded Jesus' death, mixed with the sounds of his being beaten at the hands of the court. Peter was shaking as he made his way back to the fire. As he sat down, one of the men there nodded his head and pointed in his direction. "Surely you are one of them. Your accent gives you away." Once again, Peter leaped to his feet. "I don't know the man," he shouted. One of the high priest's servants took a step closer to him. "Didn't I see you with him in the garden?" Again, Peter vehemently denied any personal knowledge of Jesus. At that moment, the first rays of sunrise drifted over the walls and fell in shining beams of gold at Peter's feet. Nearby, at the temple, the priest lifted a large shofar to his lips and blew 3 long blasts. The cock crew, the announcement, the beginning of the liturgical day. Jesus gasped at the sound. He shrank back from the glow of the fire to disappear into the receding shadows and moved toward the door. As he passed through the vestibule, he glanced into the reception hall. Jesus, bruised and bleeding, turned to look at him with great sorrow in his eyes. Peter shook his head in horror at his betrayal. Tears blurred his vision and ran down his cheeks into his beard. He ran across the vestibule, up the stairs, through the gates, and into the early morning light. He had been so sure of his love, his commitment, his resolve. Yet overcome by fear, he had failed to stand for Jesus. All that was left was to cling to another hope entirely, a strength beyond himself, a promise that though he had fallen, he would rise from the ashes once again. "I prayed for you, Simon, that your faith may not fail, and when you have turned back, strengthen your brothers." Luke 22:32. My Redeemer, I find the most difficult person I have to forgive is me, especially when I'm surprised by the fragility of my character and the weakness of my resolve. You said once that the poor in spirit would be blessed. I think perhaps I am poorer in spirit than I know. Your unfathomable grace is the true source of my strength, and help me to cling to the sure promise of your forgiveness when I fall. Then, from the ashes, I will rise again. Thank you for listening.